At the minute, there are so many fantastic philosophical ideas that are coming through. And I think for me, I'm in the position of, because the nature of my research is with people, it's with children, it's with families, and it's with living experience. So part of that is, although, we don't have a suitable explanation for either way, for me, it's which explanation does have more explanatory power for the kinds of experiences that children are reporting. It's mainly children, but also adults too. And the idea that you're right in a way, because there's never any further ontological questioning. There's so many assumptions and taken for grantedness. So social sciences, I think, can be a good example of that, where we're social science, and especially social research, which is a branch of social science, is it's very much about experience, and it's very much about people, and it's about social systems and our social reality and the social consensus around that social reality. And we do all of this research, and we do start from an assumption that we are individual biological machines or constructed entities, in the world. And we start from that assumption, and then we do research with people. We tend to categorise people. So you're this identity, so you're a homeless person, or you're a single mother, and and we're classifying people. But that's kind of identity, a constructed identity, but we're not asking those deeper ontological questions. Well, but what do we mean? What is self? What is identity? What is self? What is subjectivity? And these terms they're so collapsed and bandied around. So part of my own research with children has been to kind of question that assumption. So as well as researching what we call extrasensory experiences, so again, in social research, there's a whole spectrum of human experience that we don't consider when we are developing services for people. We just exclude so much, and it's these extrasensory experiences that are considered woo-woo, that are considered impossible. And they're impossible because the brain generates consciousness and everything's in the brain. So when people are talking about these experiences, they're deemed as impossible because we're always starting from that physicalist materialist idea about the world. So social sciences, I think, although they do have a tendency more to draw on particular theories. They are more, social sciences are more open, and some of the game is about, which theories are fitting with this aspect of social life that I'm looking at, and these relationships between people. So I think it's a bit more open than the harder sciences, or it has been.
Sure, although it does seem interesting that often the most powerful, I suppose, opponents to alternative theories of mind seem to come from psychologists and psychology, which psychology in and of itself is, of course, a social science by its nature, studying subjective experience.
Yeah. Psychology, it does go under the social sciences. And social sciences is quite a big field, but social research, it is kind of an aspect of that, and it is the more practical dimension, because it is the dimension of social science in a way that's really with people, and you're directly impacting. So for example, social policy, and it's social policies in a sense that are always shaping systems in society. So then these are huge important systems, whether that's education or health, and these are the institutions that are making up our social reality, and that we're all part of. Apparently, they construct our sense of self, our sense of identity through the languages that they use. But us as agents, in a way, appropriate those discourses and appropriate those practices. So there's this dialectic that goes on where institutions in that way are telling us who we are, or telling us, giving us, they have these claims to truth that if we want to function well in society, you know, we kind of buy into that, or we're colonized by that. And then there's this dialectic of then we will also appropriate that to be part of that system. Yeah. And there's these feedback loops, and a lot of that is done, I feel, through discourse. So discourse, a wider definition of that, it's not just about language, it's about a full range of semiosis. So it's objects, it's images, it's social practices, it's relationships between people, or between people and the state, and these kinds of things. But the whole premise is based on the idea either that the whole world is a social construction, that we're just continually constructing the world, and critical realism is quite a popular theory now in social science, where the idea is that you know, there is an objective world out there, but it's material. So it's a little bit like a reversal of, I think, analytical idealism that kind of suggests, well, there is an objective world out there, but it's mental in a sense. Although, of course, we're connected and part of the whole, but there's still that idea that there's something outside of the little mind, and critical realism is kind of the flip side of that, but they're suggesting, but that's material. Which would imply, of course, then that consciousness is also a derivative of material as well. Yes. Yeah. And one of the things that I see a lot is, at least in my view, is the conflation between consciousness and content of consciousness. So as you say, you know, everything that comes third party to us, our names, our identities, our whatever else, certain colours, certain races, whatever, are all ideas that have developed as a culture. Now, even the idea of being a human being is a classification in the human mind, and all that to me is not consciousness, it's the content of consciousness. And that's where I think your work with children is especially interesting, is kind of prior to any identification, especially with children who have never had that information from third parties to determine exactly what they are and how to interpret the world. And so they are consciousness without content, I suppose. And so, you know, it's interesting that many people, or I dare say everybody, would argue that a newborn baby is conscious, even though those identities and those things that we normally associate as consciousness, which I would call content, isn't present at the time. So it's that baseline of experience that I think is the main question to determine what that is. Yeah, it's really interesting, isn't it? And it comes back to the idea that there's so many definitions of consciousness. It's kind of a minefield out there, and we'd usually, when we think about consciousness, we think about, you know, are we asleep or are we awake? So are we awake meaning are we conscious? And the idea that children are not conscious, newborn babies are not conscious, is just preposterous in a sense. And there's so much around this too. I mean, of course, Freud would say babies come in as blank slates like this, and then that way it's you know, they're gathering and they're learning and they're appropriating again. And then there's, as they go along, the idea of child development is that Piaget talked about these particular stages that children move through. So there's kind of the to remember them now, premotor stage and the concrete operational stages, and that the problem with that has been you know, they've taken Piaget's ideas of that and made it very concrete, and in society children are measured against that in a sense. So if a child hasn't reached the kind of concrete operational stage at the time they should have done, then there's a problem with that child. Yeah. So there's all kinds of things that are circling this, and I've just been talking about this with another colleague, actually. You know, at what point, I mean, first of all, what do we mean by babies are conscious? Are we talking about contents of consciousness? Are we talking about memory? what are we talking about here? Well, we can think about awareness and being aware, but what else is going on? And for me, this is where it gets really tricky, because some of the research I do with children, they're reporting past life memories. So what are children actually coming in with, in a sense? And we don't know. We don't know, because, I mean, you can look at all the incredible research by Ian Stevenson that a lot of people in this field are really aware of, and the evidence for that. So not just this is not just what they call anecdotal evidence from very young children, but Stevenson and subsequent researchers have actually gone and validated that. So looking at children's birthmarks, looking at how that birthmark will correspond with the wound of the deceased person who the child is claiming to be, which brings up all kinds of questions about that relationship between mind and matter as well, and the whole questions around, well, what's if there is reincarnation, what is the nature of that? But circling back to that idea, it also brings into focus, well, what do babies come in with? What do we mean by consciousness in babies? Babies obviously are not verbal, and language is very much associated with growth and metacognizing and all these kinds of things. But there's still so much that we don't really understand, I feel, with consciousness with newborn babies.
I think, as you say, if Freud mentioned that newborn babies are a total blank slate, then to me that blank slate is what consciousness is, because everything else has to appear within that. The analogy is that content of consciousness could be equated to the clouds, whereas the consciousness is the sky or a movie screen.
It wasn't interpreted in that way, though, sadly, and I think that's why people got the idea that babies are not conscious, because it's down to interpretation. So the way that Piaget's developmental model has been interpreted and then used in society has been very detrimental to lots of children and families. And I think in the same way, the idea of the blank slate may have been misinterpreted or reinterpreted as, well, that means that there's just nothing there, in a sense. And we're talking about this as the no thing rather than nothing, in terms of pure awareness, perhaps.
And it's the same, I suppose, with animals as well. Is what we could never, of course, say for sure that any animal is conscious, but I think most people would agree that a dog is conscious, that a fox is conscious, that an armadillo is probably conscious. And then you got the question, I suppose, is how far down does that go? What about bacterium? What about viruses?
Yeah.
And what about plants even? So it raises an interesting question as to what is necessary for consciousness, and that's where I suppose different philosophies like panpsychism and idealism come in, which would say that it's all derivative from consciousness.
I think that comes down to the question of are they conscious or in consciousness as well? So there's that idea of, is a rock conscious or is a rock in consciousness? Is it kind of made from consciousness, produced from consciousness, rather consciousness produced from a living organism or an entity? These are huge questions, and I'm not a philosopher, so I want to put that disclaimer here. And the way I come to philosophy is I start from children's experiences, and then really be with and think about, again, what are the best models that can start to explain this. So rather than children being silenced or pathologized, which is a very big danger with children reporting these kinds of experiences, it really is more of a case of what other explanations are available. What logical explanations could be available, because materialism as it stands doesn't offer that. It shuts them down. But these experiences are happening, and materialism shuts them down. So I think for myself, and I imagine other researchers who are really looking into these experiences and exploring them, will do the same thing and say, well, we've had enough of this, and rather than being called we're doing woo-woo and none of this is possible, well, it could be possible if you start from a different philosophical position or a different idea of the world, that then it becomes very possible. And that's perhaps why, indigenous cultures embrace these kinds of experiences in a sense, because their worldview starts in a very similar way to some of the post-materialist literature that's coming out around, well, it's consciousness first rather than it's material first.
Before we continue, a brief note for those who want to go a bit deeper into this work. In addition to the public conversations you hear on the podcast, I also create member-only calm analysis videos. These are structured responses to skeptical arguments, spiritual claims, and research discussions that deserve slower, more careful examination. They're not about defending a position or attacking one. They're about taking a single claim and asking, what is actually being assumed here? What follows from it, and where does uncertainty remain? Members also receive early access to upcoming podcast episodes and shorts. Audio versions of those analyses are available through my Apple Podcast subscription, which includes an initial 2-month period free trial. So if you value this kind of careful, non-tribal exploration, membership simply helps sustain the time and space required to do it properly. Now, let's return to the conversation.
My background is social science, so I'm a social scientist but also a linguist. So my PhD was looking at how language constructs identity. So I've always looked at identity and always been fascinated with it and researched it, but not through a psychology lens, although I draw on psychology an awful lot. So just to put the disclaimer there, I'm not a psychologist. I think as a social scientist, often in academia we tend to work in silos, as my good friend Kate Adams, she writes about this, where we always have to kind of pronounce what discipline we're from, and disciplines tend to work in silos in a sense, but it would be so much better if we could kind of cooperate and collaborate much more, especially around something like the mystery of being human, for example, because I think it takes probably all disciplines. So just to go back to your question, so the work is actually a convergence of my earlier research into identity, 25 to probably a little more, 25 years of research with children. I worked for a local government for 10 years, and part of my job was to ensure that we were developing research systems so that citizens, including children and young people, could be involved in research to inform social policy, to inform government policy as well. So there was an element of that. And as a child, I also had 2 very significant experiences myself. One when I was 15 and I was in a very serious car crash, and the other when I was 5 and I was knocked over by a Harley Davidson motorbike. I was involved in a hit and run. And during both of those experiences, I had what we would call extrasensory experiences. So, for example, and I'll quickly go over this, but when I was involved in a hit and run and the motorbike hit me, I found myself up in the air. So I had kind of a bird's eye view of the entire street, and the little boy across the road who'd been throwing sticks at us and he'd been pulling his face and he was just like, now really, he'd gone white and he was really shocked because obviously this poor little boy had just witnessed, an accident. And So that would be a classical out-of-body experience, and it's something that a lot of children report within my own research. The other experience was, it was a very significant experience. This one, I was 15. The car that I was travelling in, it started to flip over, so it flipped over around 4 times, and then it smashed into a wall and it was on fire. And we were trapped inside. As the car started to turn, I had this huge thought and knowing come up that said, this is it, I'm going to die. And there was a moment of terror, sheer terror before that. And then as that thought came up, I was no longer in the car. I was nowhere and I was everywhere. But the biggest thing about this experience is I was no longer a child. I wasn't, it's very difficult to talk about this, but my sense of identity, my sense of self was unified, and I was everything. I then had a life review, so it was kind of like a panoramic, not just seeing, I was only 15, so it was very short, but also being in those moments and feeling everything in those moments. And it was so quick, but it was so long all at the same time. But I guess in our kind of clock time, it probably would have been seconds. But this was such a significant experience that, weeks after, I really struggled to integrate that kind of huge experience. Now, when I talk about this to others, they'll say, "Oh, you had a near-death experience," and I'd never thought about that as a near-death experience, because I was hurt and I was injured, but I wasn't close to death, and I hadn't died, and all these things. So now, growing up, I pushed these experiences away so I could kind of function in the world, and I had other stuff going on. I had a very difficult childhood and other stuff going on around that. And, over time, you can only push away these huge experiences for so long. And, when I hit my 40s, and I was very dissatisfied with life, and it was just coming back and coming back and coming back. So I kind of then returned into academia and got a job at the University of Lancashire, and a job where I found myself researching with children again and picking up on their conversations, talking about their strange experiences before we'd even started research about things we were meant to be researching, whether it was education or health. So it was a complete convergence, and everything just came together, and I just thought, okay, I'm gonna seriously do this as research. So the very first research project I did, it wasn't just about exploring these kinds of so just for listeners as well, sorry, what I mean by extrasensory experiences are any kinds of experiences that tend to go beyond our typical sense of an individual personhood, time and space. So they can be out of body experiences, near-death experiences, hearing voices, exceptional dreams, the list goes on and on. So children report these experiences, and a lot of children, I've done quite a lot of studies since the first pilot study, but that first study was really interesting because we also looked at self in that study as well. So what is the relationship between a child having an experience like telepathy or a premonition, and how they feel about who they are? So we started to ask within that study, who are you in that moment? And we had some really interesting responses. So some of these children were actually reporting what we'd call peak experiences as well. So, for example, some children had been in complete crisis in our study, and they'd been hospitalised. One girl found herself in the ward in hospital, and she had all of a sudden, what overcame her was this complete sense of gratitude that she'd survived. And she was looking around the ward at some of the other children in the ward, and this gratitude overwhelmed her. And then she had this incredible kind of transcendental type of experience where her individual sense of self had gone, and she was everything, she was everyone, and that extended and extended. And that helped her to recover to a point where, she was on medications at the time, mental health medications, and as she went along, that helped her to recover, where she'd even withdrawn from medication. So we asked, for example, who were you in that moment? And she was everything. She had this unified identity. And from the research, we discovered these 3 senses of self that children were reporting. So the first one was this conceptual story self. It's kind of linked to the ego self, where we have this narrative, and there's that sense of self, and that's the one we tend to operate with in the world. Then there was the next sense of self we called a transpersonal self, because when children were reporting telepathic moments, they would say, well, I was me, but I was my friend, at the same time. So there's this shared sense of self that we referred to as a transpersonal sense of self. And then the last one we referred to as the knowing I, which is the one I've just described, the unity I. And we referred to it as the knowing I because it's the idea that I know that's me, but I don't know what it is. So it's all around knowing something, but we don't have the kind of linguistic capabilities to put that, whatever that is, into words, because it's going beyond how language, it's going beyond even the mind in a way, and it's that transcendental type of experience. So that's how self and experience, because self and experience is always very closely interlinked. Even if you are doing kind of a typical kind of social science piece of research, you're always looking at what experiences do people have, and how is that shaping their sense of self. So again, if you are homeless, you become defined as a homeless person, and then you can kind of appropriate that kind of stereotype, that kind of identity. So this is very similar to that, only we're now extending beyond that narrative identity. We're extending self beyond that and looking what that might mean, and we're also extending our experiential spectrum because we're looking at these extrasensory experiences and not just the typical what did you do last week, what do you think about school, and that can be quite circular in a sense. And see, that's one of the issues, I think. So with children's mental health is a really good example, because we're still stuck with the idea that we're an identity and we're in an individual identity. The whole of mental health care for children is still based on that premise. It's really interesting. And when children report these kinds of experiences, they're very quickly pathologized. So we only have this kind of mental health narrative that parents can go to if their child are reporting these kinds of experiences, and where children and young people can go to. And again, this is very circular. So a good example of this is, child psychiatry. They've done research on these kinds of experiences, and they have immediately framed them as psychotic-like experiences. So they have identified in non-clinical, so these are non-clinical child populations, that children are having a range of these, what they call strange experiences as well. And when you look at the item criteria for diagnosing these kinds of experiences, they're very similar with the kinds of extrasensory experiences that we're looking at and identifying, but they're immediately positioned as and pathologized. So part of the research that I do is to try to challenge that and say we need to really look at this much deeper, and we need to involve children in this kind of research so that we can better inform things like health, things like education, and start to kind of transform and shape the social world in a way that's more fitting, to what we might be as human beings.
And not just how we appear to be.
Yes.
In day-to-day life. Yeah.
Because
I think one thing that I like from Dr. Donald Hoffman, I'm not sure if you're familiar with, I'm sure you probably are,
I am,
is that, we as a human animal, as a human being, we've been evolved not to see the world or ourselves as it is and as we are, but as is best for our survival.
I really like that theory, that kind of the theory of we've kind of evolved a headset that filters out in a way, many aspects of reality, and it's really, really interesting. And it's interesting when we think, because of course, mental health and child psychiatry, it's very much brain-based models. So everything's approached, it's brain-based. It's kind of the brain is a producer of consciousness, but there could be very strong links between the brain and what's going on with the brain and the kinds of experiences that children have. So think if we imagine the brain as a filter or as a headset that's filtering out aspects of reality, if something's happening with that filter, then the odds are, if the filter isn't working or the headset isn't working as it should, then odds on that you are going to have a wider perception of reality beyond that consensus of normality. And I really like the work of Alison Gopnik, and she talks about how younger children's brains, it's the default mode network in younger children's brains, can resemble brain functioning of adults who are on psychedelics. So that idea and that research, I think is it Calhart Harris, when they had they had the hypothesis that if adults take psychedelics, everything will light up, and then they did some research and it was the opposite of that, and activity was reduced. So I think Alison Gopnik was saying a similar thing, that that default mode network, there's something very similar going on with very young children and with those adult psychedelic users, and maybe that's about the filter or the headset not quite as developed yet, so children have a wider access to parts of reality.
And so psychedelics in adults kind of reduce the activity back to as it was as children, perhaps limiting the more advanced structures that came with age.
So it could still be not brain-based, but obviously it's not about saying we need to throw out all these brain ideas. Maybe we just need to relook at what do we mean, what is the relationship between brain and consciousness, because I think those kinds of questions will help us to know more about the why question, because in my own research, I've done quite a few studies now. We've just finished a huge study last year that involved nearly 200 children, and out of all of those children, something like 95% reported these extrasensory experiences, with just over around 80% reporting more than one. And what was interesting in this study is that experience types were linked to ages. So younger children are more likely to report things like past life memories of being in utero as well, so in the mother's tummy, where older children are more likely to report, for example, these kind of peak experiences. So like a meta-consciousness where they are really aware that they've come out of their ego, or that there's been not come out of their ego, but there's been some ego dissolution. But of course, I think you have to have a stronger ego to recognize that that's disappearing, whereas with children, so that's interesting. But I think what I'm saying is that could these experiences and how they're linked to altered states of consciousness be natural to childhood? And is it something that we'll lose as we develop into adulthood? Because when we become adults, we then use these tools like psychedelics, perhaps, to maybe access those childhood states.
And as you say, if these experiences are very much age dependent, that would make sense as the brain develops, that gradually over time more and more filtering capabilities are developed in the brain, and so the abilities, or I suppose the experience, the extrasensory experiences would change and become less and less and less over time as a child's brain develops more and more to filter out them. So that would make sense under that model.
Yeah.
And again, we're working with correlations, not pure causation. So those correlations can go quite easily on a filter basis rather than a generative one. And as you say, I would argue that we have a lot more evidence in favour of a non-generative correlatory link.
Yeah, I agree. I agree.
So what are the general opposing views that you find to your work with these experiences? I'd imagine a big one is the claim that these are interesting, but you're talking to children with high imaginations and, the old anecdotal evidence claim. What would your response be to those ideas?
Yeah. So, absolutely. So children are not often taken seriously, and I think this is one of the challenges for this work, is to try to have children recognised in a sense as capable agents in research. And again, this comes back to child development models. So children under a particular age are not meant to be able to have logical thinking. But children, even younger children, demonstrate logical thinking. It might be in a different way than an adult would, and an adult would verbalise that. I mean, in my own studies, I've tried to show a little bit of this. So sometimes one child can say, there was something, I heard something in my bathroom and it was this and it was this. And then the children around that child will actually there'll be a logical talk. We call it a logical talk sequence. So one child will say, hang on a minute, was that somebody on the toilet? Making a noise, and they'll start laughing. Hang on, could it be that? So that you can see these logical sequences of talk where we wouldn't normally expect to find them in children of a particular age. But not only that, we tend to value one particular kind of knowledge in a sense, which is either statistical, so it's numerical and it's the mathematics and it's the measurement. But there's a whole range of knowledges out there that are undervalued that could be extremely valuable for exploring consciousness. This could be creative knowledge, it could be intuitive knowledge, and sensory and embodied ways to represent that knowledge, something that children are quite exceptional at, if we give them the space to do that. So in terms of qualitative research itself, it's always been considered as the softer science, and historically it's tried to work really hard historically to be recognised as a serious science. So in its early days, that's why it really focused itself on more kinds of statistical kinds of research, and strong thematic, becoming very systematic, because it was always responding to that challenge of, well, it's not a real science when compared to the hard sciences. What else we have around that is the idea of subjectivity. So, qualitative research isn't great because it's extremely subjective, and anything that's objective is seen as true, as the truth. Objective claims to truth. If we think now about, for example, what some of the quantum physics is showing around the observer effect, and how as an observer we could subjectively be having an influence on the outside world and things like this, that's one point. And we have to then think about, well, what do we actually mean by objectivity? How objective can anything really be? The other thing I'll say about qualitative researchers, especially post-qualitative researchers, is the idea that we hold our hands up and say, this is subjective, and I'm really aware of my agendas as a researcher. So I'm aware of how I might influence this research because of my own agendas, my own belief system, my own identity. And that is done the first thing before doing research. So it's almost an act of mindfulness in a sense, where you are completely aware of your agendas, your power over participants and everything else, whereas that's not done in the hard sciences. But they all go in with agendas. We all do. We're humans and we want to know something, and we have agendas. So there's that part of the argument as well. Is anything really ever truly objective? Some things are more objective than others in terms of that scale between subjectivity and objectivity. But also we're talking about we're researching experience, and how measurable actually is experience. How do we measure the immeasurable? Do we really understand experience? Even mundane experiences like, that taste of tea or the colour red, we still don't have explanations for how that happens. Again, it's, well, that's produced from the brain, but there's no evidence for that. So I think that would be I don't know if it's a good argument, but I think these are the things that are coming to mind as you're, asking that question.
It comes back to what we said earlier, that there is no mechanism either way as to how consciousness could be produced by the brain or how it could exist without a brain, and yet one is favoured over the other for some reason, even though I would argue there's more evidence in favour of the alternative view. This episode is brought to you by WTF Just Happened, a podcast by my good friend Liz Ensign. Both Liz and I share a passion for exploring life after death scientifically, so we've decided to support each other's work. In her podcast, Liz, a self-described sciencey skeptic, interviews everyone from scientists and parapsychologists to psychic mediums about evidence of life after death. She approaches each conversation with a skeptical, academic mindset, whilst remaining engaging and approachable. So if, like me, you enjoy serious, evidence-based discussions on life after death that still feel friendly and down-to-earth, you'll love WTF Just Happened. Be sure to listen to her podcast on your favourite platform and check out Liz's YouTube channel for more insightful discussions. You can also find her website at www.wtfjusthappened.net. But it was interesting bringing up quantum research. A new friend of mine has been sharing some quantum research with me regarding objectivity, and she was sharing with me some studies that showed. Are you familiar with Wigner's friend, the thought experiment of Wigner's friend?
No, I'm again not a quantum physicist, so
I'm not
not great
by any
at
means
it, to be
either.
honest. Yeah,
But I think generally the idea is you got a guy called Wigner who is I think he was a quantum physicist. I think he was a real guy called Wigner, and he is outside of a room, and he's got a friend that's inside of a room. And he, outside, is seeing a quantum state in superposition, so the outcome hasn't been determined, but the friend in the room has already observed the effect, the quantum effect, and so is seeing an objective reality that Wigner can't see yet. And so it's basically like that. But essentially, she was showing me studies that did this experimentally and showed that, put things simply, that two experimenters saw different objective realities based on how they observed, and I might be getting that completely wrong, but effectively they were both seeing two different realities and both were correct. So that really does raise the question of what reality again actually is.
That's fascinating. And if you've got a paper
I'll forward
recommendation
them
for that,
to you.
because I think these are the kinds of things that can strengthen the argument in a way for why this kind of research is really important, and why we should involve children in it comes back to your earlier questions around, what states of consciousness are children actually in a way.
And what was, just to add on to that, on a slightly different, but what was interesting to me about that as well is that I was very, very, very recently, within the last week or so, looking at the work of Neville Goddard. Are you familiar with Neville Goddard?
Yeah, I've come across him.
The law of manifestation, which is something I'm very sceptical of. But within the week of looking at it, suddenly I had this lady got in touch with me, showing me about all these things, talking about objective reality and how our observation, our expectations literally change reality. And just some weird little things started happening, synchronicities, that seemed very interesting the week that I discovered Neville Goddard and started practicing some of the things that he was saying. And I'm still very, very sceptical of manifestation, but some things happened that seem very interesting. And that just relates back to the idea that, as we were saying with Wigner's friend and some of these experiments, and I'll send you the papers that she sent me. I might be misinterpreting them, but she's done a lot more research on it than I have. But that our expectations and our observations of something and our mindset can shape exactly how the wave functions can collapse, it seems. I don't know, but that's what the papers seem to suggest. In which case, that means that, effectively, there's as many universes as there are people around and animals around and whatever else. I mean, even, the universe as a whole for humanity is pretty much the same, experienced the same way. But if you look into species, the universe is going to be so different between humans and raccoons, or as I always say, shrimps or whatever else. So really, is the universe the same for us as it is for them? Not experientially. And so effectively, no. So there's as many universes as there are observers to observe it. And if these quantum effects are showing what they seem to show, then that literally would mean that we do influence what reality turns out to be.
Yeah, that's super interesting. Yeah, and would be helpful to kind of develop these arguments further of why it's super important to, involve qualitative research in explorations of consciousness. We've just set up a research unit at the university. It's called I Creates, and it's a research unit that's dedicated to exploring the nature of consciousness through a qualitative lens. So mainly through qualitative research, because we felt that there was a gap missing, and there's 3 directors around this, and there's Sarah Durston, she's a neuroscientist, and a neuroscientist who's been practicing for years and years and years, but is now looking at qualitative research as a really valuable dimension for her own research. So it comes back to that idea of interdisciplinary working as well. So it's not even saying that, well, quantitative or experimental research is better than qualitative, or qualitative is better than that. For me, it's what phenomena are we looking at? Well, we're looking at experience, consciousness, experience, self, aspects of consciousness, such as self. And what methods do we have as humans? What scientific methods, what exploratory methods, and what can we pull on and use best to answer particular research questions? So I think it's more about that. So for research with children, for example, yes, you might have a neuroscientist who wants to put the cap on and look at what's happening in the brain. But then we want to look at what is the quality of that experience? What does it mean to that child? How is that being experienced? How might that child, how can we get the fullest from that child? Well, we could sit there with a scale and we can ask set questions and then tick them off, and then we've got some knowledge. Or we can come in with participatory and creative qualitative research methods, sit on the floor with a child, get into that flow state, which is a creative state with painting, and start to ask them questions while also observing what are they doing with their bodies. Because children tell us a lot without speaking. So a really good example of this is, if I go back to the example of one of the children from our own studies who she reported memories of a past life experience, past life memory. And as she's telling us what happened and how she died, and then after she died, she ended up in mum's tummy, in utero. She had memories of that as well. But as she's explaining, I was a lady. We didn't ask her, what time period were you in? Because children won't be able to answer that. But what we noticed is that she started to pull an imaginary dress. So this little girl had pants on, but when she was talking about this lady, she was straightening a very long dress that you could interpret as something someone in the 1800s might wear. So as researchers, we're observing all kinds of representation from children, and then we can then use that knowledge and then ask the child about that. Why were you doing that? What might that mean? And what we find is that children can come up with more detail. Is that imagination and fantasy? You asked that earlier, and we didn't go into that really. Yes, it could be. But what's interesting is, and I'm going to use a study that I'm really involved in at the minute. So I research children's near-death experiences, and I've been co-leading a study with my colleague Graham O'Connor at a children's intensive care unit in the UK, and we're looking at children's near-death experiences. So we interview children around 2 weeks after they've died and been resuscitated, and some of these children have died 3 times and been resuscitated. Some have had major kind of heart transplant operations, so there's a lot going on with these children. What is really interesting about, we asked them 3 questions. We asked them, what happened before you fell asleep? What happened when you woke up? Well, what happened in the middle? And of course, the middle bit we're asking about is the period when they died. And children report the core features of near-death experiences that have been reported for many years now with adult populations: moving through the tunnel, going towards a light, sometimes seeing a helper, feeling great, incredible feelings of love and peace, and etc., etc. And because we have the core features of the near-death experience, so children are reporting that. And the way I think about this is, many children probably don't know what a near-death experience is, and might not have access, probably don't have access to all the literature that's available now on these are the core features of a near-death experiences. Nor would they have, I don't think, the knowledge to know that the expectation to have one when they die. But they're still reporting that. So why are they reporting that? It has to be through experience. They're experiencing that.
Do you find, as well, just to add to that, sorry, before you continue, because one of the major kind of arguments against the reality of near-death experiences is that people see what they expect to see based on culture and background. As we say, Westerners will see a tunnel. Often they'll see, if they're Christian, they'll see Jesus and various other things, heaven, pearly gates, etc. If you're in Japan, you won't go down a tunnel. You'll cross a river. You'll go into some Buddhist. I don't know much about Buddhism, but Buddhist, is it Bardos? Or is that a different one?
Yeah.
Anyway,
yeah, I think
it'll be regardless. It'll adhere to one's expectations. And with children, especially very young children, it seems from what I've seen that the core, and of course, even though the interpretations are different, the core experiences are the same, which is leaving the body, traveling somewhere, meeting entities, often, as in your case, a life review, and then returning, being told it's not your time yet, and returning. And regardless of interpretation, those core experiences always seem to be the same. And as you say, with children as well, do you find that a lot of those experiences are a lot more directly the core experience as opposed to being shaped by experience, by expectation?
Yeah. So, yeah. Now, at the moment, we've only involved 8 children in this research, and this research has been happening for 3 years. Now, I don't know if you've come across Melvin Morse. He was...
I've spoken with him a few times.
And I think he'll always say over 25 years there was a really small amount of children, because it's really difficult to do this research with children and recruit children into studies. Now we're just starting on the second phase, which is going to involve 30, which is a huge number for these kinds of experiences. So the point I'm making is I can only speak from the experiences of a small number of children in terms of my own research. What we have found is there is very minimal cultural interpretation or phenomena that's reported. Children tend to report the core features, and the children also report a loving darkness. So I think
loving void, as others would call it.
Yeah, and it's something that isn't scary. It's completely loving. It holds them. It's a feeling of comfort and safety. And we often think about this. We talk about this, and we say, "Gosh, doesn't it sound like the womb? It sounds like a womb." That's what we found. So we've not found. Children also report bedside visions, out of body watching. We've had a child, he watched his own operation. It was, I think it was a heart bypass or something like that. So we've got other experiences around that, but that can be after the event or it can be before the event. But when we're talking about that actual what happened in the middle, it tends to be those core features and that sense of this loving darkness. And I think I can't remember who wrote about this, but it's linked to some of the ancient scriptures where they call it the midnight sun as well.
Possibly Gregory
Midnight
Shushan.
Sun. Was it Gregory Shushan?
It could have been. He's very much retrospective near-death experiences.
Yeah. Now, of course, part of our research is, and we've just got a paper coming out on this actually, is that the other reason why it's important to involve children is if you look at the field of near-death research, children are missing in a sense from that field. So we've done a literature review that tries to document and scope what actual scientific academic research has been done with children. So not adults remembering when they were children, but actually with children and their near-death experiences. And aside from Melvin Morse, which was 1983, 84, 85, 86, there's barely anything that's been done. And there was a very prominent paper that came out in 2021 by, I think it was Sam Poinier, and it was a huge group of near-death researchers who are all fantastic. And these were guidelines and kind of going forward for doing excellent near-death experience research. And children were in the footnotes. They were just in the footnotes. So we're kind of challenging that and making the argument that it's so important to involve children. Because again, this goes back to what we were saying earlier about the conditioning. And as we grow, we have layers covering something, and we're more conditioned in a sense. Children are not as conditioned. Children may be closer to a source, to some kind of ground of being, to something that we're losing sight of as we get older. Surely that makes them an excellent research population. It also makes them a reliable research population. So again, going back to kind of, it's not always fantasy, it's not always imagination. And then we can ask, well, what do we mean by imagination? And that's probably another podcast, because what is imagination as a state of consciousness in a way? They're reliable because it seems that they're coming directly from experience rather than adding something and making sense of an experience through their cultural conditioning, through their concepts.
So they're more likely to report it as it is, as opposed to how they interpret what it was.
Yes. Yeah.
So through children, you're most likely to get as close to reality as you actually can without those.
I would argue that. I would argue that, and I think the same goes for extrasensory experiences, because again, the study that we've just completed, that investigated children's experiences, but children from various cultural and ethnic backgrounds across the UK, but from various cultural and ethnic backgrounds. We also involved adults in that study, because it was, what are children's experiences, but what are adults' perceptions? So there's the difference between direct experience and, perceptions of adults. What we found with children is that regardless of the background, they were reporting the very same kinds of experiences. From a phenomenological perspective, the phenomena was exactly the same. The ways that they were representing their experiences were very, very similar. So it was like kind of very neutral reporting. It was just this very sensory, very experiential kind of reporting, whereas their parents were reporting. We asked them, has your child reported this, and what do you think this is? And then we'd get kind of the religious narrative, the spiritual narrative, sometimes the mental health narrative, because again, that kind of colonization for parents from mental health discourses and things like that. And again, for the professionals in that study, well, it's mental health, it's brain-based, it's child development. So you've got these three different things going on, but of course, power relationships between adults and children is adults will always prevail. So no matter what children are telling us, it's at the moment, and we hope to change that, but at the moment, it's that, and it can't be anything else. So, but the point being that it's interesting how, and especially the younger children, the older children in the study, they were really conscious of it being taboo. And they were kind of, they'd say that, if we said this to a peer or to a parent, they'll call us schizophrenic. Even if they hear a voice, and even if that voice that they hear has a direct message for somebody that's meaningful. So that's so in parapsychology, they would refer to that as mediumship capabilities. But no, it's still, and don't get me wrong, as a parent, it's frightening if your child would say to you, Mum, I'm hearing a voice. We immediately go, we contract, and immediately, because that's, what we've become so accustomed to. We don't have a middle way to try and explain these kinds of experiences in a comforting and in a way that can say, well, you know what, they might be really natural, and don't worry. And because they're children, they just might be really open. And I know that's a bit of a woo-woo word, I'm really open, but open in the sense of the filter's more open, or the headset's kind of keyed into different aspects of reality. And we need that now, I think. We need something. We need a middle way somewhere where because a lot of the parents said that they're silent about their children's experiences, and they do not trust the services. They do not trust mental health, and they feel that mental health doesn't have a full understanding, and their own cultural worldviews are not listened to, and they're not valued or respected. So yeah, it needs to change. It really does. And that again comes back to, we need to change maybe our own idea about the world in terms of, materialism, because it's so keyed into that.
It is. And I think the only offering that materialism has to these experiences are, as we say, either it's imagination, it's mental health, or it just doesn't happen, it's a misremembering or something, which seems odd given, and it's not just, from psychological and social science evidence, but it's from empirical evidence, as you say, with psi phenomena and remote viewing and evidential mediumship and terminal lucidity and various different phenomena that all converge together, which to me is highly evidential that perhaps it's worth considering that materialism and emergence from matter isn't the correct approach.
Yeah.
But it seems amazing to me that the default is just to ignore or dismiss all of these lines of evidence because it's not possible, because we already know something that we don't know.
With parapsychologists as well, that they're just so brilliant. So they have to work harder, I think, to show that their experiments are so reliable or they're replicable and all these kinds of things. And they're outstanding scientists, and still you'll get skeptics who say, well, that can't be, or that's a load of rubbish, or whatever they're saying, and they've not even read the research papers and the methodology, and they are so rigorous, these scientists in parapsychology. Thinking about it, this goes back to what we were saying about the past life studies from Stevenson and the scholars who are at the University of Virginia. The data that they have got, it's astounding how that is not informing policy. And I know I sound kind of outrageous maybe saying that, or highly controversial, but there is such outstanding evidence that children are really remembering some past lives. I mean, we don't know what past life means. I mean, some people might suggest it's souls jumping into one body or another. I don't see it like that. I would, again, thinking about the nature of consciousness, I would see it more in a sense of maybe it's pools of consciousness in some way, and there's this kind of storing of memory or something, and I don't think it's as simple as people are kind of jumping into new bodies and things
indeed.
like that.
And especially overly complicated as well, at least from our human perspective, when we hear of these experiences that occur in a state that's not within time. So even using the sense that the term past life is probably incorrect to how it ontologically actually is, because it may all be allegedly all happening now.
Yeah.
And whatever that means from a human perspective is impossible to kind of know. But so I think, the substrate of what consciousness and reality actually is just going to be so far removed from anything we can imagine that it's all we can do is get as close to guessing as we can from the experience, unless you have a personal experience, in which case that's a different level of knowledge entirely.
And it's one that you can't really. It's like that finger pointing to the moon, so you can kind of point towards that experience and what that is experientially, but again, because it's something that goes beyond our words, our language, again, trying to convey that, it goes beyond the scope of interaction so for me it's always in a way going to be that finger pointing at the moon, but we have to point. We have to kind of move away, and especially if we think about the world at the minute and just look at what's happening. I mean, if now isn't the time, I don't know when would be the time.
And it would, friends of mine have said, and I agree, it'd be very, very interesting to see what would happen if some of the world's leaders were to have experiences like a near-death experience, and see how things would change.
Yes, I was thinking that actually the other day. I was watching the news and just getting so about it all, and that was my thought. Can you imagine if these people in power, but well, not just had an experience, but really had it and kind of embodied it, and because we've also been hearing where people who are claiming to have these experiences are wrapped up in the most awful things. I mean, there's so much that's been coming out this week where I think it's not just talking about something, it's embodying that in a sense and bringing that knowledge into the world in an embodied way, and people in power could do so much good with that.
And one would think that if one actually had a genuine experience like this, that it would be an automatic embodying, because it would be so transformative to your knowledge of what you are and what everybody else is in relation to you, that there would be no other... I think
it's more of a process. Yeah, my view for what it's worth is that it would be more of a process, and that there are layers of integration.
I suppose with
layers of integration,
it would be easier, I suppose, for children, as you were saying, to integrate, because they don't have those layers of interpretation that would need to be torn away in order to properly integrate these experiences. So perhaps for an adult, especially adults with the necessary personality traits to be in these leadership positions, that would be a lot harder, I'd imagine, to pull away.
Yeah.
Yeah, but it would be a very interesting thing.
We can only hope. We can only hope.
For sure. I think one last thing I'd like to touch on is you mentioned that it was interesting to you how, regardless of the evidence of reincarnation, that the information we've gathered from those haven't been introduced into policy. What kind of policy, kind of change would you imagine should be influenced by these evidences?
Yeah. That's a really good question, and I can't really answer all of that. But I'll get an example is, so if we look at past life research with children, and I have a wonderful PhD student called Elaine Rycroft who is actually researching this now for her PhD. And again, I want to say that because I think that shows that there's some shift where, in the UK, where we can actually now have PhD students who are dedicating themselves to these things. So what Elaine's looking at, and what some of the research is showing, is that children who have significant past life memories can suffer, because some of these past life memories can be really traumatic. So they can start to exhibit behaviours, for example, where they're struggling, and as services are not equipped to deal with that, and they could potentially parcel that off as something else. So imagine if this was kind of fully accepted, and this happens, and we could then start to shape services around that actual experience. That would be better for children. It would be better for parents, but it would be better for services, because, for example, children's mental health. So much money into children's mental health, but it all seems circular. So because we're not really getting to the crux of what is the nature of the human mind and what does it mean to be human, instead of just keep saying, well, this is the mind and these are disorders of the mind and this is this. And so a young person can go into the system, they can be treated, they can be medicated, they can be sent away, and then they can be back in that 6 months later.
Treating the symptom, not the cause.
And it's circular. So for so many reasons, we really need to open this up and, be more courageous, be more controversial, and start to try and bridge some of this research more into the mainstream. Because I think that's the only way we can affect change.